Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait for a few minutes, 2-3 minutes, until people join. Welcome. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the RiskKAN's webinar on early warning, early action for cascading risks to food security. I'm Robert Sakic-Roglic from EASA, and together with Marlene and Andrew, I co-coordinate our RiskKAN working group on warning and preparedness for a riskier world. Today we have a talk by colleagues from the Chatham House and Practical Action on early warning and early action for cascading risks to food security. And I'm going to introduce the speakers and give them the floor in few seconds. However, before that, I would like to invite Marlene to tell a few things about RiskKAN and the existing opportunities. Marlene, please.
Thanks, Robbie, and hello, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here. Just on behalf of RiskKAN, as the chair, together with Kai Kornhuber, we've opened the self-nomination for the steering committee. So until upcoming Monday, it's possible to become an active part of RiskKAN and our steering committee board. In the chat, I've added all the information and also the link to the form where you can sign up as a steering committee member. So yeah, we're really looking for people from all over, both academia and outside of academia, to join our steering committee. If you have any questions, just feel free to either put it in the chat and I'll respond later, or send me an email. And then yeah, I look forward to receiving a lot of applications. Thanks.
Thanks, Marlene. And similarly, in the case you would have interest in the working group warning and preparedness for a riskier world, please do reach out either to myself or to Marlene. I'm going to leave my email in the chat later on. So now I would like to introduce our today's speakers. So we have four speakers. We have Dr. Mirianna Budimir. Mirianna, if you could wave. Who's a senior climate and resilience expert within the Impact, Influence, and Innovation team at Practical Action, where she leads the organization's work on equitable early warning systems and provides technical support to programs across Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. Mirianna has a PhD focus on cascading multi-hazards and risks and serves as the global lead for Practical Action's Missing Voices approach. The second speaker is Bhargavi Bharadwaj, and she's a research associate in the Environment and Society Centre at Chatham House. Previously, she worked with the UK's Committee on Climate Change, where she led and supported national progress assessment of climate adaptation. Then we have Richard King, who's a senior research fellow in the Environment and Society Centre at Chatham House, and he was a lead author of the UNEP's most recent flagship environment assessment and was previously deputy head of research at Oxfam in Great Britain. And finally, we have Tamanna Rahman. She's a climate resilience thematic lead at Practical Action in Bangladesh. She leads the work on disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and people-centered early warning systems. Tamanna provides technical support to key initiatives, including the Zurich Climate Resilience Program, and she's trained as an architect and urban and regional development planner and has over a decade of experience in development planning and management. So now I would give a floor to our speakers for the presentation. The presentation will take, I was told, approximately between 30 and 40 minutes, and then we will have space and time for questions and hopefully a very interesting discussion. So please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. Yes, we'd just like to present some findings from a research project that we have collectively been involved in for the last couple of years, covering cascading risks to food security, early warning systems. So I'll start off kind of giving a conceptual overview and the genesis and how we're thinking about the issues, and then I will hand over to other people to sort of dive more into depth in the project as a whole. We took a global perspective, but we also did some specific work in Bangladesh and Senegal. So we'll present those findings as well before coming up with our conclusions. So so just to kind of kick off in terms of how we're thinking about the issues and what we mean by cascading risks to food security and why we've been doing this work. I don't think this will come as a surprise to anyone, but obviously global food security is under increasing threat. We're well off track in terms of meeting the SDG target. Still around 1 in 3 people worldwide were moderately or severely food insecure in the last couple of years. 1 in 11 faced absolute hunger. In terms of some of the risks and threats to the food system, 3.5 billion people live in countries that are highly vulnerable to climate impacts, which obviously affects the food system. 200 million people needing international humanitarian aid by 2050 potentially. And from some of these increasing natural disasters, we are losing around 5% of agricultural GDP every year. So there's increasing, obviously, humanitarian effort to kind of deal with these issues in the wake of them, but we can't carry on being responsive to these issues. We kind of need to get ahead of them, and that's obviously where early warning systems come in. Just in terms of how we're thinking about the food system, obviously a lot of these natural disasters and other forms of risks, which I'll go into a bit more detail on, critically affect agricultural production, but that's not the food system, and risks of people's food security is much broader than that. So, food production is only the first part of food systems, which basically involve everything from the initial production in the fields through to the processing, the retailing, and the consumption. And that's the value chain, but the food system as a whole has got all of these other elements around it which enable it or impact upon it and affect people's food security outcomes. So things like demographics, consumption choices, market dynamics, technological innovation, climate factors, and obviously the broader political and geopolitical environment, and obviously environmental change, people's well-being, impact food systems outcomes. And when we talk about food security, often we think primarily in terms of availability and access, but of course food security is more than that. It's the ability to have for the human body to utilize the nutrients which it takes in, and stability over time in these all of these other access and availability factors. So in terms of how the food systems and food security is at risk, there's sort of multiple points at which the system can come under threat and people's food security can be impacted. And this study has been thinking particularly about more complex and cascading risks. So obviously there are direct impacts on the food system. If you have a drought, if you have a flood, that directly knocks out food production in many instances, but there are often many kind of knock-on second order, third order effects from some of those disasters. So just to kind of walk through how we are thinking about the initial hazard and how that translates into sort of some of these more cascading forms of risks. There are multiple forms of initial triggers, the initial hazard that can trigger this cascade risk. So I've mentioned the sort of climatic factors and the hydrometeorological, that could also be geophysical hazards. I think that's the one we tend to think about most. But equally, there could be more slow onset natural hazards, so seasonal changes, long onset droughts, but also things like economic shocks, security and conflict events, political and institutional shocks. So some examples might be, you may remember the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal a couple of years ago. In the end, it was only for about 8 days, but that completely disrupted the global trade throughput. So events like that in the trading system. Obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has not just had a direct impact in the Black Sea, but because that's such a significant breadbasket region for the world, that's kind of had knock-on implications both for importing countries, but for food markets more generally. And even if you're not directly dependent, that's kind of had impacts through food price shocks. So there are multiple factors that we're concerned with, and obviously any one of these can cause problems, but obviously once you get 2 or 3 of these interacting, then that can start to trigger cascading risks that we are perhaps less familiar and less well equipped to deal with through our conventional approaches. And then moving on to how some of those initial risks sort of transmit through the system. There are various sort of mechanisms or vectors that through which these might occur. And I guess I've just touched on some of them, but things like supply chain disruptions, impacts on the financial system can affect people's economic access to food. We can see forced migration as a second order impact of some of these insecurity concerns, and that in turn can affect both people's access to food and also their ability to utilize the nutrients. Psychological factors, so that might be market sentiment driving prices higher, or it may be sort of people's willingness to kind of engage, to go to local markets and their feeling about how they access food. Some of the broader geopolitical issues I've touched on, biophysical risks as well. So I guess a particular concern about how environmental impacts are changing the spatial distribution of vector-borne diseases and what that means for human health and what that means for crop health and how some of those factors may influence food system production. And infrastructural issues, as I mentioned, things like the Suez Canal or port access in the wake of a flood. So multiple ways that some of these initial hazards can then sort of transmit through the food system. And just to kind of conceptualize some of those dynamics of how that might happen, obviously, as I mentioned, sort of we are very familiar with these direct risks where you have the hazard, and here the hazard is represented by the purple hexagon, and the green triangle is sort of the recipient risk, so the person or the community that is ultimately impacted by the risk factors. So the direct one we're very familiar with, but we can equally see compounding indirect risks where, as I said, there could be a confluence of initial hazards that both impact on people. So that might be a climatic hazard and a conflict event. So those two factors may interact to compound the risks. There may be a sequential cascade. So this might be something like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where you have the sort of direct impact on production, but then that transmits through food systems, through markets, through sentiments, through national dynamics in importing countries. And then you may get some more complex feedback cascades where sort of the interactions of the components within the food system chain may interact in more unpredictable ways. So multiple ways that kind of these initial hazards, which we're very familiar with thinking about, may affect people's food security. And just to kind of give a example of what that might look like on the ground, this is from Insecurity Insight, just an example of a localized conflict. This is relatively local example, but of course some of these dynamics may be cross-border as well. I don't need to read through it all, but you can see sort of some of these multiple factors are not just problems in themselves, but may kind of build up and interact in unpredictable ways, both in terms of the conflict dynamics themselves, but then so what that means for people's access to market, people's ability to absorb nutrients, people's ability to carry on with agricultural production. And as you kind of move through this chain from left to right, there are increasingly poor outcomes for people's food security. So these are the kind of dynamics that we are interested in. And just to say, I think obviously there has been increasing work done around multi-hazards. I think many people on the call will be familiar with that. But I think possibly our starting point and our critique is that although we are improving our understanding of multi-hazard events and thinking about how those different hazard events interact with one another, we're perhaps not quite so good at that, thinking how the exposure and vulnerability, which together with the hazard form the risk, how the exposure and vulnerability to different hazards interact. So thinking about multiple risks, not just multiple hazards in the round. So those are some of the dynamics we're interested in. In terms of moving on to early warning systems, I won't spend long on this, but I think early warning systems are just one intervention point within a broader disaster risk reduction life cycle. So in the light green at the top of that diagram, early warning system enables anticipatory action that typically happens in the time frame between an event being forecast and the peak impact of that event. And if you look at the shapes on the right, how that early warning system tends to operate is either to try and block the initial hazards actually getting to the affected community at all, so moving people out of harm's way, for example, or it may be a form of working to adapt and work with the local community to improve their resilience to that hazard. So that's sort of the typical intervention point. But as I said, for early warning systems for anticipatory action to sort of really to be better embedded within sort of the broader life cycle of disaster risk reduction approaches, we probably need to be thinking about how these approaches can better interact with things like adaptation much earlier on, how that can be built into social protection systems, how that can be built, the synergies between that and disaster reconstruction. So this is just to kind of say that early warning systems are one part of this life cycle, but for them to really for them to be a stronger part of that, then they should be better integrated into some of these existing mechanisms. So thinking about them in the whole rather than in isolation. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Mirianna.
Thanks, Richard. So we know in the wider literature that the early warning systems can be really effective mechanism from preventing predictable hazards from becoming humanitarian emergencies, and they can protect lives and livelihoods when they're working well. So we're seeing, the general statistics around 8 times lower mortality rates when we have effective early warning systems in place, and 30% less economic losses when there's a warning issued before an event. So these are effective mechanisms that we can use to potentially prevent the impacts of these types of crises on the people at risk. Next slide. But a critical thing that we were focusing on in this project is, do these early warning systems actually consider those cascading risks to food security? And some of the questions we had before we started the project, and in terms of the conversations we're having, is, do they monitor cascading risks to food security? Do they consider all aspects of food security, including, the availability, access, utilization, and stability over time, so not just kind of extreme hunger events prediction? And then also thinking about, the people-centered approach to this is, are they actually providing the right information at the right time for the people who are at risk to take early action and reduce, the risks and the impacts of those cascading events on food security? Next slide. And again, so the project we've just coming to the end of, it's funded by Citi Foundation, led by Chatham House, and in collaboration with Practical Action. So it's a 2-year research project where we had kind of 3 main objectives. So firstly is assessing the challenges and the opportunities for integrating those considerations of cascading risks to food systems into existing early warning systems. Secondly, to improve our understanding of how those cascading risks of food systems are actually experienced at community level, and how well those communities are supported by early warning systems. Are they having comprehensive, actionable, and accessible information? And this is where the case studies in Bangladesh and Senegal were coming in to really drive that understanding from the local level. And then from this approach is develop recommendations for not just the communities that Practical Action is directly working with, but also the institutional decision makers who might have responsibility for food security related mandates or early warning systems, to strengthen how do we integrate those cascading risks into early warning systems, how to improve early warning and anticipatory actions so that we're reducing those impacts on local food systems and food security. Next slide. So the methodology here again is we took a global approach overall. So we have some global findings, but also we did deeper dives into 2 case studies in Bangladesh and in Senegal. The data that we used to analyse came from a review of the literature. We conducted key informant interviews both at the global, national and subnational level. Focus group discussions were held at national and subnational level. Household surveys were conducted in Bangladesh, and then Practical Action's Missing Voices approach was used both in Senegal and Bangladesh. So this is our approach where we specifically target those who might not be participating in the surveys or the focus group discussions, but we know who are particularly vulnerable to food security or might have difficulties accessing information through the early warning system. We scope out who those might be within a particular context, and then we make proactive efforts to reach out and listen to those most marginalized people, hear from their experiences in a very kind of narrative, qualitative way, and use those insights to feed into a kind of more detailed understanding of those the outskirts of society, into the processing of the wider data in terms of the kind of the more majority data we're getting from household surveys and focus group discussions. We also, throughout the process, conducted stakeholder workshops and consultations. So at the global, regional, national and local level. So providing input into the data, but also reviewing initial findings and then having conversations about what the potential recommendations and implications of the findings were. So it's kind of a very iterative approach, very participatory throughout the 2 years. Next slide. And with that, I will hand over to my colleague Tamanna to talk about the Bangladesh case study.
Thanks, Mirianna. So if I give a brief background on Bangladesh scenario, Bangladesh mostly experiences climate-induced hazards, including cyclones, flooding, and heat waves. And these hazards are increasingly interacting, and they are creating compound and cascading risk across the food systems. And we have seen in recent years that these disasters creating a very complex scenario and causing massive disruption in agricultural production, creating agricultural losses, including sharp drops in main staples. We have a very robust early warning system, but those are very hazard specific, like the cyclone early warning system, if I can mention. And single hazard specific early warning systems are working very well, but these largely hazard focused interventions are underutilized for protecting food production, access, and livelihoods. So against this backdrop, actually, this study was undertaken to understand how the early warning and early action can be better integrated into the existing food systems to prevent the cascading impacts into food systems and strengthen the food security. For Bangladesh, we have actually selected, initially we selected 2 districts, but we thought that it is better to understand the overall perspective of the country, thinking about different agroecological zones, starting from the northern to northeastern, central Bangladesh, southwest, and southeastern parts of Bangladesh. So 6 districts we have worked, and we have done household surveys around 735 with lots of focus group discussions and key informant interviews, as Mirianna mentioned. So in the next slide, if I talk about our overall findings, we found that our food security heavily rely on 2 major cropping, Boro and Amon, 2 seasonal crops. But our study found that food shortages peak specifically in the month of July and September, and these overlaps with some of the crops, either sowing or harvesting periods. And when I say July, it's initially the initiation of the monsoon period, but that is followed through the April-May extreme cyclonic period. So this puts the specific crops into critical situations. And damaging crops is not only the challenge. We have seen that in the southern belt, like in Satkhira, where we conducted our study, we saw a massive challenge in the fishing gears and aquaculture production. And there is loss of harvests, and also food consumptions are shifting because of the cascading impacts. And when food consumption is shifting, this is also impacting the nutritional vulnerability. And if I talk about some of the quantitative data that we found, that out of the 735 surveys we conducted, 72% reported food price hikes after disasters, while around 28% could not access local markets post-disaster. And a lot of transportation issues were reported, especially during flooding season and also post-flood scenario. Market closure is another challenge, especially in the flood and cyclone-prone areas. Around 62% people reported that. And overall, in our study across the 6 districts, we have found that 35% of communities, they were classified as mildly food insecure. We have utilized the IPC's food security index, and which is largely utilized by FAO and other agencies. And overall, 22% experienced low food security, while 26% experienced very low food security. So overall, when we explored that, what are the challenges and opportunities of integrating compound and cascading food system risks into existing early warning system, we have seen that siloed hazard monitoring is one of the challenges, and absence of food security specific early warnings is also a massive challenge, which we have seen in the data. Limited use of impact-based forecasting, like for cyclone, we are not very well still in impact-based forecasting. Also for flooding, weak monitoring of cascading effects, data gaps in technical is another technical constraint, and multi-hazard early warning protocols, it doesn't exist actually, and inadequate preparedness and response systems. So what are the opportunities? We also tried to explore through different qualitative and quantitative analysis. We have seen that developing impact-based forecasting system and common alerting protocol, which our government is already started working on, but also enhancing interagency coordination. We have these IPC-led warnings, but that is not integrated within the relevant disaster and hydrometeorological departments' warning systems. And also strengthening the community-based early warning systems, end-to-end early warning systems mechanism is also another opportunity or areas of improvement for us. And capacity building, definitely at the national and subnational and local levels. And yeah, investing in digital innovations, risk communication, and strengthening the risk knowledge and working across the full spectrum of early warning systems is very much important to integrate the cascading risk components into the overall early warning systems to better enhance the food systems. So yeah, I'll stop here and I'll hand over to Mirianna again. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamanna. So I'm just presenting on behalf of my colleagues from Senegal here. We do have some on the call who can answer any questions specific to Senegal. So for Senegal, the case study, we were really focusing on the area of Kaffrine, which is a rural area, which is fairly dependent on agriculture. In Senegal, many people living in rural areas are experiencing food insecurity, and the impact of food price inflation is really impacting people's access and availability of food. A lot of their income is spent on food, kind of importing food for them to eat to supplement their agricultural activities. And we're seeing that there's a range of different natural and pest-borne hazards that are affecting agricultural production and food storage. So not just where the food is growing, but also after it's been harvested and collected, the food is being damaged by flood, drought, and wildfire and locusts. And we also saw that in COVID, it really affected people's access to food markets, so they're unable to travel. And then there was also lack of food getting to markets for people to access them. Next slide. From the research that we did in Senegal, we're seeing a range of different types of cascading risks caused by environmental, climate, economic, social, political, and biological and health types of triggers. So things like, bushfires causing destruction of grazing land and vegetation, which also directly impacts availability of food. So you can see there's a variety of different triggers that cause subsequent shocks and impacts that directly affect availability, accessibility, utilization, or stability related to food in Senegal. Next slide. And so we're seeing these various different cascading risks to food security, disrupting food systems and deepening food insecurity, particularly during lean periods. We saw across the board social inequalities increasing the vulnerability and impact. So those who are people with disability, disabilities, people who are widows, those with chronic illnesses, whether people are elderly or young, and then also particularly if there's loss of family, really increases the dependence on others or on kind of others' support, and reduces their resilience. So particularly, female-headed households, particularly widows with young children, really facing that kind of heightened food insecurity because they have a limited income, they have limited labour capacity, and they also often lack that wider family support to provide that kind of resilience buffer. We're also seeing that whilst there are food security alerts or food security information or warnings that exist, or food security forecasts that exist at the regional or national level, is really not getting down to the local level. So it's fairly fragmented. Mainly the information is targeted at institutional decision makers, maybe NGOs, but not really targeted at sharing that information down to the local level with communities at risk. At the local level, there's a little knowledge about early warning systems related to food security, so they don't have access to the information, maybe don't understand the potential implications, lack of awareness that this could be predicted. It's kind of very response driven in terms of, okay, yes, it's a lean period, so our crops, we know that it's going to be a lean period because we've just been experiencing flooding, so we need to adapt to it rather than actually preventing it or doing anything in advance. And so we're then seeing, because people aren't taking action in advance because they don't have access to early warning information, really negative coping mechanisms, particularly for those more vulnerable, marginalized populations. So borrowing money, seeking aid, or going into debt, and that's really providing temporary relief or can worsen their vulnerabilities, particularly during kind of longer term or widespread events that are affecting the rest of the community that they can't rely on. And with that, I'll hand back over to Richard, I think.
I'm going to hand straight to Bhargavi to go through the global findings.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you, Mirianna. If we can go to the next slide, please. So in our global research, we're basically accumulating all of these findings, including from the case studies, on a research paper about how to bolster food security through early warning systems. And our findings are that existing food security early warning systems face fundamental design limitations. They're mostly built around single climatic hazards, and while comprehensive multi-risk frameworks remain underdeveloped when compared to the existing ambition in advancing multi-hazard approaches. We've seen conversation around this within the Early Warnings for All initiative as well, and I think hopefully the Cascading Risk for a framework that is consistent within this report can help us conceptualize how these risks interact. Next. Yeah. All right, thank you. So for the key limitations of why this single hazard and climatic focus is not working, as explained in the country case studies as well, they have a reactive focus, and this focuses on the final risk that is experienced by communities. But many of us that are sort of interacting at that community level, and NGOs and international organizations supporting these actors, can often see that the deteriorating conditions are already in place, that people are already facing impacts to their food security prior to an adverse, weather impact, for example. And this is often due to the market conditions that they're dealing with and other facts of their socioeconomic background that make them increasingly vulnerable, even prior to a weather impact. There's an underestimation of upstream drivers that have a correlation to their different components of their food security. So whether that's access, utilization, stability, for example. And yeah, this inadequate attention to transmission risk mechanisms in global food systems can mean that we're not acting essentially early enough, which is the, kind of the hypothesis of early warning systems. We know that these work, and they have been able to not only save lives and livelihoods, but also deliver on cost savings. And all of this is happening within the, broader landscape of us having greater multipolarity in our governance systems, increased contestation over resources and policies, and the securitization of our food supply chains. What this looks like in practice is that while there is sort of recognition that cascading risks will naturally affect us, their practical implementation for these multi-risk frameworks and early warning systems are limited outside of large international organizations or monitoring bodies that often sit at that international or regional level. This capacity is particularly lacking in national governments, and especially in the food security context, this looks like a lot of focus on food availability and not so much on other aspects of food security. So kind of needing to take that more holistic approach in order to more comprehensively understand hunger and people's needs as well. There's barriers to access and comprehension of early warning information, which is a key disruptor in how communities understand what preparedness measures they should be taking. So again, that community-centered focus is absolutely essential in sort of linking the global, regional, national, and subnational levels. And by way of this sort of initial single hazard processes that we are sort of extending more to dual hazard contexts or starting to think in multi-hazard contexts, the institutional and disciplinary sort of data barriers are quite complicated in the sense that we're not sharing data adequately with other organizations, and there's sort of a lacking mandate of a overarching body that is able to have oversight over all of these different data sets and how they interact with each other in a particular national context. And we're seeing a lot of funding limitations as well in actually enabling more comprehensive overview. Next slide. So in terms of recommendations for how we can enhance monitoring and response preparedness in response to cascading risks to food security, one of the first areas that we're targeting is the governance mechanisms for food security early warning systems and anticipatory action. So as mentioned from the findings, sustained funding routes are extremely crucial in order to enable this. And one of the things that, in the international level, there's kind of quite a lot of responsibility for advancing this discussion on where anticipatory action funding is most useful and where it's most, needed. However, that needs to be complemented with different types of blended finance mechanisms as well, whether that's climate finance, disaster risk finance, or private financing as well, bringing in the insurance industries and so on. The interoperability of data systems are crucial because we can see that, there's a lot of technical and specialized branches that essentially can hold this data information, but that interoperability doesn't exist. So one of the components that we were looking at is, for example, agricultural trade market data, and what that's able to sort of tell us where there is a lack of information at that ground level because of something like a, conflict scenario emerging. So kind of having a confluence of different data sets can help us fill some of those, ambiguities that we're currently facing in the decision-making process about enabling anticipatory action. And then we had sort of the aligning of mandate for forecasting initiatives as a crucial priority as well. So this is often noticeable at that regional level where, regions, for example, in West Africa, where there has been this enabling of coordination and collaboration by regional experts forecasting food security scenarios, and they have that interoperability of data sets. It's very useful in being able to, one, cross-reference, but also build on each other's information systems and have that knowledge sharing component in order to facilitate a timely and actionable response. And last but not least, elevating cascading risks in governance frameworks, because I think one of the challenges of the way cascading risks overlap across different sectors means that there's no real ownership for these risks. So really determining who is responsible for what type of risk cascade and how within the governance mechanisms we can monitor and action against any adverse impacts. Next. The second sort of bucket of our recommendations are on improving the understanding of and responses to cascading risks to food systems and food security of at-risk communities. So this recommendation mostly focuses on the regional and national levels. And part of it is the uptake of real-time monitoring of key drivers of food insecurity. And this is already happening in mechanisms like WFP's VAM. So there is already, some thinking around this real-time monitoring component, but how do we institutionalize that and build better capacity at the regional and national level? Because that is also one of the things that we've kind of identified in our research is those regional contexts really understand what's happening at that subnational and community level and are able to, have almost the training and knowledge base on cascading risks potentially develop and be slightly more the owners of like the custodians of that knowledge that can pass down to the national and subnational level. So again, that kind of builds on that point on knowledge transfer as well, and that responsibility for capacity building of national and subnational actors. One of the things that came out in the case studies is, for example, on capacity building, given that early warning information can be quite complex, there's often this sort of gap between the information actually being provided to the subnational level. However, they don't quite understand or they haven't been adequately trained in order to respond to those types of information. So upskilling at that level. Again, adequate funding, so working with international actors in order to be better prepared. And there's also an onus on national governments to see if for specifically the missing voices, so the communities that are, always marginalized from these early action protocols, whether they can be covered in social protection mechanisms or just be provided with earlier information during the communication stages and so on to enable an earlier action and ensure they're still being covered even in sudden onset crises. So that kind of requires us to be quite community-centered and integrate communities as well as subnational authorities or volunteers that have that inbuilt trust with the community into the design of our early action protocols and early warning systems as well. And in terms of the responsibilities for researchers and civil society within the space, it's the support that can be provided at the regional, national, and subnational level to really conduct multidisciplinary risk assessments in order to understand what the specific vulnerabilities are in that context and how can these be better addressed within the design of how early warning systems are being deployed in that region. And finally, the focus on strengthening anticipatory action plans at that subnational and national level. This is a common thread throughout each of the recommendations, but supporting the planning of sustainable financing strategies. One type of funding is not your catch-all solution. And I think the burden of sort of financing shouldn't just fall on one stakeholder, or particularly at that subnational or national level, but instead it's that thread that cuts across from the international down to the subnational. And then the community-centered knowledge building, we've spoken of things like how to integrate communities within really facilitating who is excluded within previous sort of early action processes and protocols, and then building that sort of knowledge into communication design so that it's representative of their needs and who they feel it needs to be a central focus of that protocol as well. And integrating frameworks of communicating and responding to risk cascades within the already very developed designs of how we respond to early warnings. Thank you so much.
Perfect, great, thank you very much for the presentation. It's a lot of really interesting stuff, and I've seen some claps throughout the presentation, which means it really resonates a lot with a lot of thinking within the community. The floor is now open for questions. We do have a question in the Q&A section. I'm just wondering, and sorry for not knowing, because the first time we're organizing the webinar doing Teams, can people speak up? If so, Adam, do you want to say your questions, or I should read them? Do you want to give it a shot?
Thanks. I think I've been made speaker now. Thanks very much.
Perfect.
No, I think this is excellent. I've really enjoyed this. I think the logic is quite clear. The challenge is quite clear, and it was very, very, very well articulated. I really enjoyed it. I put two lengthy comments or questions in the chat. I apologize for them. This has provoked some really cool ideas, and it's a lot of the stuff that I end up working on. I guess it boils down to something. I'm not picking on you, Dr. Bharadwaj, but this is something that you were saying at the end of this, which I think is quite acute, which is the recommendations you make are really good. They're about sensitizing multi-hazard early warning systems to be thinking about the impacts of all hazards on food, on the different dimensions of food systems. But that's all really, I mean, it's good and not really that complicated. It's correct. but it doesn't do what Dr. King was talking about, which was talking about the sort of multi-dimensional drivers of exposure and vulnerability on as they play into it. So the system is still hazard driven and sort of one directional. And I think it's good. And I think we could even talk about like exposure triggers and vulnerability triggers as thresholds, but it wouldn't look like an early warning system in the way that most people think about early warning systems. And I think, as I put in the last one, it would suffer even more acutely from the challenge of action. You know, currently early warning systems are plagued by sort of, yes, we got the warning and no, we didn't do anything. And I think that it would be even more challenging to say, oh, your food security sort of passed a bad threshold and even less action would come of it. I don't know that there's a good answer to that. I think it's still worth doing. I think it's still really valuable to think about what are those exposure and vulnerability triggers that we really need to be monitoring, especially in conjunction with the hazard triggers. But I don't think that it's as easy as we hope it would be, or as that it will be as instantly valuable as we hope it would be. Orva.
Should I come in on that? Okay. Thank you, Adam. So I think one of the things that I wanted to mention, but kind of glanced over there, but was the fact that existing warning systems have that, climatic hazard focus, and it's what the multi-hazard community has essentially been discussing, is that there's non-natural hazards as well. So where these are, for example, I think we touched upon the, Russia-Ukraine conflict. That is a hazard. It's a non-natural, non-climatic hazard, but it's happening elsewhere. And then you can kind of use the same cascading risk methodology even prior to your, forecasting sort of information coming in. So it's almost monitoring different drivers and risks, and using that information simultaneously to what your traditional forecasting would be. And it's just recognizing that there's these multiple points of sort of overlapping impacts to food security that can cascade down from both direct and indirect causes. So it's essentially seeking that complementarity and trying to expand the discourse. It's not trying to, replace one or the other sort of mechanism. They both kind of have its place, but it's trying to, identify what the other root causes would be, and then how these can then slip downstream into that impact. Mirianna?
Yeah, just to build on that, thanks, Bargui. A couple of points here. I think there are definitely opportunities here that, impact-based forecasting, the movement towards that, if we're focusing on the impact of those potential risks on people, then we can kind of build back from that. And that should be starting to building that kind of understanding of vulnerability and exposure and those dynamics there as well. I think the other thing to mention that we, this, even just 40 minutes of talking about this, there's a lot more stuff to unpick. Something within the wider work that we did is that NGOs and government and particularly anticipatory action community are already trying to just kind of piece together different types of information from different sources to try and make those sorts of decisions anyway. So there's already kind of an effort to try and figure out that kind of contextual understanding of the potential kind of cascading risks and do something about it. It's just not particularly formalized. It's not particularly holistic. It's very kind of ad hoc. So one thing would be is trying to do that in a much more consistent, coordinated way. And another thing that we picked out in the report is that yes, very hazard-driven quantitative assessments for early warning systems that exist. There needs to be a much more nuanced kind of expansion into qualitative information and kind of that more expert-driven decision making. So we're not suggesting collecting loads and loads and loads more data to monitor. And then lastly, the other point that you raised in terms of the existing issues with early warning systems is potentially could compound it. I think that the thing we need to be focusing on is starting with the people at risk, starting with what are their needs, what are the risks they're facing, what are the actions that they can be taking, and that defines the thresholds, that defines what we're monitoring, that defines the information that we're gathering, and that defines how we're alerting, how we're communicating it. So yes, it's very kind of single hazard early warning systems are too hazard driven anyway. So by moving towards a kind of more multi-hazard, multi-risk, cascading consideration, if we start with what people need, we'll be building better early warning systems that are actually going to be fit for purpose if we start with that.
Thanks for the questions and discussion. Mariam, I noticed you had your, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. And hello to many faces that I know here. Very, very interesting and relevant topic and research. So thank you for the presentation. It was very comprehensive and extremely interesting to me. I guess I had a follow-up question related to how to truly integrate, these different, I know we're moving away from hazards, and in a truly multi-risk warning system or multi-risk approach, you would look at vulnerabilities and different types of risks. That includes, conflicts, shocks, food security, health, emergencies, and as well as all the vulnerabilities that people are exposed to. So I was interested to hear a little bit more about the framework that you are developing. Is it going to be, because one of the needs that I believe Tamanna brought up in her presentation is that we do need food security specific warning systems. So I wonder if the framework would kind of map on different climactic situations or scenarios, and then map it onto kind of food security patterns or insecurity patterns rather. How would a framework integrate, the climactic with the food security consumption patterns and all of that rich data? And then the other question I had following up with Mirianna, what you had said is, of course, as you know, the community has, especially farmers, have very extensive generational knowledge even of many of these cyclic weather patterns like El Nino. They already know how to deal with drought. They already know how to deal with floods. They sometimes even monitor it themselves, different drivers, and can in some situations know through these indigenous practices of when these cyclical patterns would come up. So I wonder how your framework is integrating their knowledge, their generational knowledge of, past weather and climactic patterns. Thank you.
Maybe I'll take the stab at the first part of that question and then hand to Mirianna for the second. I think it's a good point, and I think the framework as we have it is probably more a kind of conceptual device than a kind of actionable decision support tool. So I think just because the nature of how these risks, whether they are embodied in the hazard or the exposure or the vulnerability, because there is such a plethora of ways that these risks can develop. I think it's almost impossible to try and ex ante kind of map out all possible forms of risks and how they may transmit and how they may affect different communities in different places. So I think perhaps, trying to do that in the abstract is perhaps a fool's errand. I think what it does enable you to do is kind of think through, for any given community or for any given institution, sort of what are the pieces of the puzzle that we have identified, and what are the factors that we've left out, and what are some of those that are within our mandate or our remit that we can sort of take direct control over, and which of it may we need to start having discussions with other institutions. And I think to that point, I think a lot of the problem is, and going a bit back to Adam's point, I think we're not trying to pretend that early warning systems are the only part of the solution here, but I think that they need to be much more embedded in a broader risk understanding. And I think we just, in some places, we do see that kind of end-to-end kind of risk ownership, but there are very few governments or agencies that have that kind of holistic risk ownership from start to finish. And I think unless it's very siloed within government departments, and often the monitoring departments don't have the mandate to sort of implement the policy. So I think unless you've kind of got civil contingency frameworks, or unless you've got sort of ownership in cabinet officers or prime minister's offices that are kind of playing that central coordinating role that can kind of bring all these pieces of the puzzle together, then I think it is going to remain a fragmented picture. So I think, I don't know that our framework helps that, other than to surface it as an issue and to kind of highlight some of the institutional gaps and weaknesses. Mirianna, shall I pass to you?
Yeah, just maybe a couple of, I'm very conscious of time, a couple of points on the local and indigenous kind of traditional knowledge, and maybe Tamanna, you can chip in as well if you've got time. The local knowledge, traditional and kind of historical knowledge, really not only provides us with an opportunity to integrate kind of much more local information and monitoring, but also they have understanding of who is at risk, what those impacts might be. They know intuitively what those cascades and kind of potential impacts will be. They are best placed in terms of knowing what early actions they can take without receiving additional support from external actors. But also there's a bit of caveat there in terms of often the indicators that we've traditionally been using related to climate are changing, so they're maybe not as reliable as we would hope they would be, and then also recognizing that there are probably new risks that they may not have faced historically, so there is a role there of, yes, there's that integration of that local indigenous traditional knowledge, but also recognizing it's an integration and being supported by other information, other scientific information, but it's not a kind of knowledge hierarchy. They should be on equal level. I know we're at time, but I don't know whether Tamanna could just squeeze in a couple more points if you wanted to reflect before we close. Tamanna?
Yeah, thank you. So, no, I think, Mirianna, you have covered, but just like, as you mentioned, that farmers already know what early actions to take, but we have seen that for some crops, the biological threshold, like the extreme heat event, farmers are getting like flowering disease, or like the groundnuts that they are harvesting that was supposed to be harvested before flood, but the extreme heat is destroying their groundnuts, which they weren't aware of. So in this sort of emerging hazards, this is where we need to enhance the risk knowledge, and we also need to build on the existing, traditional knowledge that they have. And I think Richard already covered the conceptual framework that we are thinking of, but the IPC food security phase clustering, they always say that this country is like Bangladesh is maybe extreme food security or moderate food security. And we also get to have these, seasonal forecast of extreme hazard scenarios, but how we can integrate these food security alerts and these hazard alerts, this is something maybe we can work on in future. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We are past the time, so we'll have to slowly wrap up. So I would like to, on behalf of myself, Marlene, Andrew, and the wider RiskKAN group, like to thank the presenters for a very insightful presentation. Thanks everyone who joined and for interesting questions. And please do stay tuned for upcoming early warning system group webinars. Have a lovely rest of the day and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.